Good morning, everybody, and happy Easter. My name is Aaron Brown. I'm also one of the pastors here at Woods Chapel. And so Easter is all about Jesus being dead one day and alive the next, and it is a big deal. And it makes me think about a story about a man who went out onto his back deck on a beautiful spring morning, sort of like today. Sun is shining and warm, the birds are chirping, and so he's out there enjoying his mug of coffee early in the morning, and it's so peaceful, and then that peace is shattered when all of a sudden he sees this golden retriever in his backyard shaking the life out of their neighbor's pet rabbit. So he's like, oh no, this is bad in so many levels. It's especially bad because there's a kind of a tension between the neighbors already. This is going to be a disaster in the relationship with their neighbors. So the man panics, he drops his coffee, he runs out after his dog, chases his dog down. By the time he gets the rabbit out of the dog's mouth, the rabbit is very dead. And it's covered in dog spit and covered in dirt and mud. And the man holds the rabbit in his hands and he looks around and he sees that nobody has been watching this. So he takes the rabbit inside his house and he gets it in the kitchen sink and he runs some warm water and he gets some shampoo out of the bathroom and he's shampooing the rabbit and getting all the dirt off it. And then he towels it off with a soft white towel and then he gets the blow dryer, the hair dryer, and he blows the bunny's hair so it's all fluffed up and he brushes it so it's looking really good. Very dead, but looks really good. And then he ninjas into the neighbor's backyard where the cage is, and he puts the bunny in its cage and kind of props it up, and then closes the door to the cage, and then sneaks back home like nothing happened. A few minutes later, he hears screams coming from his neighbor's backyard. So he runs over, kind of all innocent like what's happened? What's going on? Is everything okay? And the neighbor is pointing at the rabbit's cage, saying, Our rabbit, he died last week and we buried him and he's back. Listen, all resurrections are shocking and unpredictable and unpredicted and hard to believe. And today we are celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. But I want to frame this in terms of a question that I think the resurrection invites us all to ask. And maybe it's a question, I don't know if it's the best question in the world, the most important question in the world, because you may disagree, but it is a very important question, especially if you haven't asked this question since you were a child. Or maybe you haven't asked this question since you gave up on the faith. Or maybe you haven't asked this question as a Christian in a very long time. It's so important that you ask it, and maybe today's a good day. And the question is, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And it's so important because the resurrection is what convinced the early believers that Jesus was who he said he was. It was the resurrection that led them to a place to say, okay, Jesus said he was the Messiah, then he must be the Messiah. He said that he was the Son of God. It must mean that it's true. He is the Son of God. The resurrection is what confirmed all this, that Jesus was God in a bod. It wasn't his teaching that convinced people. It wasn't his miracles that convinced people. It was the resurrection. And it's still convincing people today. But listen, let's back up a little bit. We don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead just because the Bible tells us so. No, it's way, way, way bigger than that. It's way, way, way better than that. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because a first century follower of his, a Jewish man named Matthew, who was a tax collector of all things, followed Jesus and wrote about his life and wrote about his death and wrote about his resurrection. That's why we believe. We believe that a Greek named Mark, who was a friend of the Apostle Peter, Mark followed Peter around and heard Peter tell his story as an eyewitness of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That Mark wrote out that story, believing what Peter believed. We believe in the resurrection because a doctor named Luke, who was also a Greek, he followed Paul around the Mediterranean, but Luke also kind of functioned as an investigative journalist. He interviewed everybody that he could find in the time that he had who had encountered Jesus, who had heard Jesus, who had seen Jesus resurrected afterwards, and he wrote out what we call the Gospel of Luke. And we also believe because the Apostle Peter is an eyewitness, he left us 2 letters behind that he wrote to the early church that talked about Jesus rising from the dead. And we believe that Jesus rose from the dead because, and this is my favorite, because James, the brother of Jesus, concluded that his older brother was his Lord. Now, what would it take? What would your brother have to do to convince you that he was your Lord? Exactly. I have an older brother. It would be very, very hard. But James, while Jesus was alive, James was not impressed by Jesus' sermons. James was not impressed by Jesus' miracles. James looked at his brother as his Lord when he saw the resurrection. See, these are ordinary people, but extraordinary people in some ways. They're brave people who documented what they saw and what they heard from others who had seen the resurrected Jesus. And then those documents were collected, those documents were protected, and eventually they were combined into a volume that we call the New Testament. But long before there was a Bible, there were men and women who were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. It was the resurrection that changed everything. And the people who were closest to Jesus were excruciatingly honest. In fact, this is one of the reasons why you should take their account seriously. The people who wrote about their experience of Jesus, they didn't write themselves in as heroes. They wrote themselves into the story as doubters. All of them doubted. Listen, they expected Jesus to do what all dead people do. What is it that all dead people do? They stay dead. And Andy Stanley puts it this way. I love this. He said, nobody expected nobody. Everybody who loved and was devoted to Jesus figured that once they saw him buried, he was gone for good. When Jesus was killed, not only did they kind of change their lives, but they had to think that everything Jesus said was a lie. Because Jesus called himself, he said, I'm the light of the world. You can't crucify the light of the world. He said, I'm the resurrection and the life. That's what he said about himself. You can't kill the resurrection and the life, can you? They must have assumed that everything he said was not true. The other person that was an eyewitness and follower of Jesus who gives us his account is John. And John was a witness of both the crucifixion and the resurrection. And he details both for us. But like the other followers of Jesus, John did not expect a crucifixion, didn't see that coming, and he certainly did not expect and see a resurrection coming. What John expected is what all the other disciples expected, and that was that at some point Jesus would rip off his disguise as a Jewish peasant and reveal himself as a king. The king who would take the occupying Roman force and kick them out in an act of war and violence. That's what they expected Jesus to do and be. And Jesus had this knack for knowing what they were thinking. And at the Last Supper, they're at this meal together, right? The Last Supper, it's a Passover meal. Jesus knows what they're thinking. And so instead of creating a battle plan, Jesus says, all right, are you guys listening? Are you guys listening? Here's my new commandment. Here's what I want the future to look like. And he tells them simply this, John 13:34, love one another. That's your plan, Jesus? Yeah. No, it gets better. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must love one another. And the subtext here is, don't love others the way you've been loved, because that could have been a very imperfect love. Don't love others the way you want to be loved, because that can also be a very imperfect love. I want you to love others the way I have loved you. And then the next day, he would give them a demonstration of love that would blow their minds. So that all happened at that Last Supper, at that Passover meal. They go from that meal, and Jesus says, we need some time and space to pray. And he loved to go to this place called the Garden of Gethsemane. And so he takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, all of them but one. Judas had already kind of made arrangements for Jesus to be captured. Judas betrayed Jesus. And so all that unfolds in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is captured. The disciples scatter into the night. There's a real quick trial, a religious trial. The religious leaders put him on trial. It was an illegal trial, even by their own rules, their own standards. The religious leaders pressure the Roman governor, a guy by the name of Pilate, Pontius Pilate. They pressure him by saying, hey, this Jesus character is saying he's a king, and we know that there's only one king, and that's Caesar, so, you need to take him out. We can't kill him, but you can kill him for us. I mean, you can just kill him. Pilate says, wait a second, I've interviewed Jesus, I've investigated this. He's done nothing worthy of the death penalty. I'll just flog him. Just flog him. I'll just flog him, and that might pacify the people. So Pilate has Jesus flogged, then brings him back out to the people. Hey, does this not take care of it? Aren't we good? And the crowd says, no. They start shouting one word over and over again. What is that word? Crucify. 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 Pilate's a practical man. He wants to get this behind him. So he says, all right, I wash my hands of this. Crucify him. And John, who was there for all of this, says at that point, this is verse 16 through 18, the soldiers took charge of Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, and there they crucified him. And John doesn't give a lot of detail about the crucifixion because everybody in the first and second century had seen for themselves a crucifixion. They knew what it looked like. And then John records the words of Jesus from the cross, because John's standing right there at the foot of the cross. John's standing there, and he hears as Jesus looks down at him, right at John, and says, John, take care of my mom. Will you take care of my mom? He hears Jesus say the words, I thirst. I'm thirsty. And so they scramble and they find some soured wine, and they get a sponge and they soak some of that up and they put it on a stick and they reach it up to Jesus so that he can slake his thirst at least a little bit. And John is there when Jesus speaks his very last words. He says the words, it is finished. And he dies. John does something strange at that point in the story. Rather than kind of recounting and building the narrative, he kind of steps outside the narrative for a second, and it's almost like he's speaking into the future. He's speaking through time, maybe speaking to us right now. He says this in verse 35, the man who saw this has given his testimony, and his testimony is true. John's simply trying to say, I'm just telling you what I saw. I'm just telling you what I saw. I saw Jesus die, and I saw what happened afterwards. So then John starts the narrative again, and this is verse 38. He says, later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. He was accompanied by Nicodemus. Nicodemus and Joseph, kind of two interesting characters. They are Jewish religious leaders. They sit on the religious Supreme Court, if you want to put it that way, and yet they're secret disciples of Jesus. They can't bear to see his body just hanging there. It's torn apart by wild animals or birds, whatever. So they get his body. And it goes on. So later, Joseph of Arimathea and Pilate asked for the body of Jesus. He was accompanied by Nicodemus. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, and taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and the strips of linen. Why did they bring 75 pounds of embalming stuff with them? Because they expected Jesus to do what all dead people do, stay dead. Nobody was expecting a resurrection. John goes on. He writes, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb. And because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. The subtext of this is a reminder. This would have been on a Thursday. Friday is the Jewish Sabbath at sundown. It starts. And so they had to, this was Friday actually, and at the end of Friday, Sabbath would have begun. They had to get all this work done before the Sabbath started because no work could be done. There was an empty tomb there, so they used this tomb. And then Joseph and Nicodemus, what did they do? What would you do? I think they just went home. Meanwhile, you got to ask the question, where are the rest of the disciples? Where are John and the rest of the disciples? Well, they're back at the place. They've kind of made their way back to the place where they had the Last Supper. At least that's what we think. They're there. They knew it was a gathering point. So they're there. Can you imagine what it must have been like that Friday night? What were they talking about? They talking about things like, we would? How are you feeling? Did we just waste 3 years of our lives following this guy? He can't be who he said he was. Did they have those kinds of discussions, or was it just silence? Did they sleep Friday night? What about Saturday? The texts tell us that they just stayed there. What did they talk about? Did they say anything? We don't know. But we do know what happened Sunday. We do not have a Sunday. John tells us that early on Sunday morning, they were awakened by somebody banging on the door. And their first thought has to be, the Roman soldiers are coming to get us, just like they got Jesus. And then their second thought has to be, Roman soldiers don't knock. They just kick the door in. So they open the door, and there's a woman standing there. Her name is Mary Magdalene. She was one of Jesus' most devoted followers because Jesus had set her free, given her a new lease on life. And she's standing there. She can't talk. She's sobbing. She's in a panic. She finally gets out what she wants to say. This is verse 2 in chapter 20. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. She assumes what anyone would assume. She's not assuming a miracle has happened, is she? She's not assuming a resurrection has happened. She's assuming somebody stole the body. Well, John and Peter have been hiding in that room for 2 days, afraid for their lives. Suddenly, I don't know, they get a wave of courage, a wave of curiosity, something, and they felt the urgency of the moment. Here's what John says in verse 3, chapter 20. Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. By the way, John is the other disciple. And you got to wonder if he's thinking, well, Peter's not here to be embarrassed or to contradict me. I outran Peter to the tomb. Why does he bring that up? I don't really know. But he gets honest and he says, all right, he takes a step back in the next verse. Says, okay, I'm going to tell you, if I tell you that part of the story, I got to tell you the entire story. John writes, he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. So John's like, well, I got there first, but I couldn't go into the tomb. Why? Because it's a tomb. It's dark. It's scary. But Peter arrives and goes right in. But John's not trying to make himself out to be a hero here. He wants to let us know that he's confused, that he's afraid, just like all the followers of Jesus were that first Easter. And John says this, we saw the strangest thing and our world changed. Here's what he writes, verse 6. We saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. What's he getting at here? He's trying to convey to us, this was not a robbery. Because thieves don't unwrap dead bodies. Thieves don't unembalm bodies. Then he says this, John 20, chapter 8. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. John gets the courage to go, and his world changed. Because the resurrection of Jesus framed his entire life all of a sudden. It reframed everything about his existence. It dawned on him that everything that Jesus said was now true. Everything that Jesus said about himself was true. Like when Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. John's like, yeah, that makes sense. That Jesus is the best, clearest picture of the God who created all this that we can possibly have. When Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, he's like, yes, I get it. It hit him. We don't know where Jesus is right now, but clearly he has risen from the dead. I saw him crucified. I saw him die. I saw him embalmed. I saw him buried, and he has risen. So remember, this is John and Peter. They're at the tomb. All this happens there. They run back to the place where the rest of the disciples are. And of course, the words are just spilling out of them, what they've seen and all this. And while they're telling the other disciples what they've seen, suddenly there is Jesus standing among them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus is there standing among them. And Jesus says the words, peace be with you. Why does he say, peace be with you? Because he just scared the bejeepers out of them is why. So they're all trying to get their wits about them, and they're asking Jesus questions. Wouldn't you have some questions for Jesus? Where you been? What just happened? How are you alive? They start asking him questions. He's like, this is all great. I'm kind of hungry. Can we eat something? So they make a meal. They eat. They believe. They believe. All of them believe, except for one. There's one who isn't there. For some reason, Thomas is not with the other disciples, which leads to a whole bunch of other questions. Why is Thomas not there? I mean, I kind of go to this thought of he grieves differently than the rest of them did. You know, some of us grieve differently. Some of us want to be around people when we hurt. Some of us want to be alone. Maybe that's Thomas. But they have the meal together with Jesus, the ones that are there, minus Thomas. Jesus leaves. Thomas comes back together with them, and they're telling him, hey, we saw him, we ate with him, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive. And Thomas doesn't believe him because he's the doubting Thomas, right? It's kind of like, hey, John, I love you, but your words are not enough. Peter, I love you, but I think you're seeing things. I love all you other disciples, but I just spent three years of my life following a false Messiah. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life chasing a ghost. Well, later on, Jesus does the same thing for Thomas that he did for the rest of the disciples. They're gathered together again. This time Thomas is with them, and there's Jesus in their midst. And Jesus says the same thing he said to the other disciples, peace be with you. Why did he say peace be with you? Because he just scared the bejeebers out of Thomas. And then he knows that Thomas is more tactile in his faith. And so he says to Thomas, hey, I know this is an important part of your belief. Feel the holes in my hands, my wrists where they drove the spikes. Feel the place in my side. Remember they stabbed me with a spear while I was on the cross. Feel that place in my side, Thomas. It's okay, you're not going to hurt me. Just feel it. Thomas sees, he feels, and he believes. He makes a statement. He says something like, my Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. And then Jesus says to Thomas and the disciples, but I think he's really saying it to you and to me, speaking through time again. He says this statement, verse 29. He says, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Who's he talking to? Us. Jesus is speaking into the future generation. He's saying, blessed are you because you've seen me, but blessed even more so are future generations who believe because of your story, because you're sharing what you have seen, and they believe even though they have not. And then John wraps up his account with this. He closes with an invitation for all of us, and the invitation is very simple. It's what he had said throughout his gospel. This is John 20:30. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, not recorded in his gospel. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. It's the whole goal, that you might believe and have life. I don't know, maybe 2020, as strange a year as this has been, another one, right? Just what we needed, another strange past 12 months, a violent past 12 months, a difficult past 12. Maybe this year, 2020, is the year that you answer the question for yourself. For yourself, who's Jesus to me? And John would say, well, I hope you answer that through just listening to what I've shared with you, and that you do believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is love that walked on this planet, the love of God walking around, that Jesus is the very mind of God teaching what life can look like and what life can be like, that in believing that, then you experience life. What is life? What kind of life might God want us to experience? I think it's a life of purpose and a life of integrity and a life of self-sacrifice. A life of deep joy. A life where we embrace suffering rather than run from it. A life of deep connection to God and to one another. That is the life that really is life. So there are the dots. Connected right there. Jesus coming back from the dead that we might believe, and in believing might have life. So maybe Easter 2022 is that day where you say again, okay, Jesus, I believe. And by the way, there's that reminder, you don't have to understand everything to believe something. You don't have to walk out of here with all your questions answered in order to say, I can believe something without having to understand everything. And maybe today's the day where you say, Jesus, I do believe, and I choose to follow you. All I got to tell you is what I believe, and that is that the resurrection is real, and that Easter is real, and it changes everything. And for today, that is the good news. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.